The Nile, the world's longest river. A 7,000-kilometer lifeline for almost 400 million people. Flowing north, the Nile runs through 10 countries. From the highlands in the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A source of sustenance, but also one of tension, even potential conflict. For centuries, Egypt has sought to be master of the Nile, seeking to tame the river's unpredictable flow and to ensure exclusive control over its use. But today, countries upstream are challenging this dominance and are pushing for a greater say and a greater share of the River Nile. Cairo, capital of Egypt. A teeming metropolis that has grown on the banks of the Nile. It's the first day of spring, when Egyptians from all walks of life flock to the river to celebrate the arrival of the new season.
بالتأكيد هناك في ضمير كل المصريين.
Every Egyptian wants to live by the Nile.
إذا استطاعوا فإن لم يستطيعوا.
If they can't, then at least they can sit and picnic there.
أحلامهم الصغيرة.
It's the place of their dreams.
المهمومون.
Everybody from young lovers to troubled souls come here for different reasons, either to enjoy themselves or to wash away their pain.
يزيح الهم عنه.
The ancient Greek writer Herodotus described Egypt as being the gift of the Nile. It was a fitting description.
The major cities that run along the Nile are only there because of the Nile. If the Nile wasn't there, it would just be another part of the Sahara Desert. You know, it would just be dust and sand. You couldn't live there without the Nile. It is the lifeblood.
Attached to this source of life, 95% of the Egyptian population lives along its banks, just 5% of Egypt's land. The rest, just desert. The Nile may be most commonly associated with Egypt, but its waters begin their journey thousands of kilometers upstream. There are two main sources of the river. One is the Great Lakes of Eastern Africa, and the other is in the Ethiopian highlands, where the majority of the Nile waters originate. This is the summer rainy season in Ethiopia. The rainfall forms gushing rivers and tributaries. They collect here in Lake Tana, Ethiopia's largest lake and a main source of the Nile. This 600-year-old monastery is situated on one of the lake's many islands. Decorated with biblical paintings, it belongs to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The custodian of the monastery is Abba Dawit, who believes the Nile holds magical powers and is akin to God.
The
Nile is one of the 4 rivers mentioned in the Holy Bible that feeds heaven.
samaj betaq nat.
The Nile gives us, as well as other countries like Egypt, all sorts of benefits.
የተለያየ ጥቅም ይሰጠናል።
Water isn't the Nile's only gift. The surging streams in Ethiopia turn red with silt washed from the volcanic plateau. This silt, rich in nutrients and minerals, is borne downstream. It was to prove a blessing for the first settlers in the Nile Valley thousands of years ago. Each year, rainfall in Ethiopia caused the Nile downstream to flood its banks in what is today Egypt. This annual phenomenon, known by the ancient Egyptians as the inundation, was celebrated as a divine event. It was deified in the form of a god known as Habi.
If you look at the pictures of this character engraved on the walls of Egypt's temples, you find that Habi is a strange character. He's a man with large breasts, but not a woman. He also has a protruding belly. So these two characteristics symbolize fertility and generosity granted by the Nile.
Fertility was the key gift. When the Nile flood receded, the rich silt carried by the river remained behind, fertilizing the soil, creating arable land in stark contrast to the surrounding desert. Ancient Egypt was the birthplace of agriculture. Techniques developed thousands of years ago are still in use to this day.
We still use the old plow, the one pulled by cattle. There are many tractors here. My uncle has a tractor, my neighbor has one, everybody has a tractor, and I could borrow one at any time, but I prefer the traditional methods.
The pharaohs have long since passed from the stage of history, but some of their legacy endures. From time immemorial, the river has been a subject of adoration.
O bountiful Nile, O bountiful Nile, O bountiful Nile. Ancient Egyptians exalted the river Nile. There's an old chant that goes, people don't eat jewels, they eat the bread made from the wheat that grew on the banks of the river Nile.
But there's a darker side to this love of the Nile. Such adoration can lead to possessiveness. For the Egyptians, the Nile is unquestionably their river, above and beyond the claims of any other Nile Basin country. By the early 1900s, Great Britain ruled the length of the Nile. Egypt was strategically crucial as the Suez Canal controlled access to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. To co-opt their allies, in 1929, Britain awarded the Egyptians exclusive control of the Nile.
The 1929 agreement stated that Egypt had the right to veto any project on the Nile that would affect its share of the waters or the flow of the river to the north towards Egypt. This stipulation was based on the fact that Egypt completely depends on the Nile waters, while the upstream countries have other water sources.
30 years later, in 1959, a second agreement was signed. Freed from colonial overrule, Egypt and Sudan agreed on dividing the river's waters. During the 1960s, African nations upstream gained independence. Nowadays, these countries are challenging agreements signed when they were under colonial rule.
Look at the other legal instrument, 1959, between Egypt and Sudan, where two countries sit down, like we are sitting now, and agree to share the entire waters themselves, and knowing very well that this water that they want shared within the two countries actually emanates from other riparian states.
To this day, Egyptians regard the 1929 and 1959 agreements as technically binding. Egypt has its reasons for wanting to uphold the treaties. Its share of the Nile waters has remained at 55.5 billion cubic meters, as stipulated in the 1959 agreement. However, since then, Egypt's population has tripled to over 80 million, taking the country into water poverty.
These agreements give us a minimum amount of water, less than what we actually need. We aren't harming any of the Nile Basin countries. They don't need the Nile. They get their water from nature. The annual amount of rainfall at the sources of the Nile is 1.6 trillion cubic meters. Egypt and Sudan use less than 5% of this amount. The rest, that's 95%, is lost through evaporation in the swamps.
But sometimes rainfall is not enough. Famine has ravaged states through which the Nile flows. Here, in Ethiopia, one of the river's sources, the failure of the annual rains has led to catastrophe in the past. Millions have died. Beyond such tragedy, upstream states claim the past agreements violate their national sovereignty and prevent them harnessing the river for their own development.
I know that some people in Egypt have old-fashioned ideas. Old-fashioned ideas based on the assumption that the Nile water belongs to Egypt, and that Egypt has the right to decide as to who gets what of the Nile water, and that the upper riparian countries are unable to use the Nile water because they will be unstable and because they will be poor. These circumstances have changed, and changed forever.
The change came in May 2010 at a meeting in Entebbe, Uganda, when the upstream countries took matters into their own hands. In an unprecedented move, 6 of the 8 nations signed a new agreement declaring greater autonomy in decision-making over the Nile's waters. Aware of the agenda, Egypt and Sudan had refused to attend. What was signed in Entebbe set off alarm bells in Cairo, touching the very chord of Egyptian fear about its water source.
It is a red line for Egypt's existence. There is a difference between security and existence itself. We are wholly dependent on the Nile. We have no other water sources. So, the truth is that any threat against the Nile waters will result in the reduction of Egypt's share. This would threaten us with thirst and death.
The spectre of a water war looms over the region. For Egypt, securing the Nile waters is a matter of national security, even if it means military action. A common feeling shared by most Egyptians.
Egypt would die. What would we drink? Of course we would fight. We will fight anyone who attempts to stop our source of water.
Throughout its history, Egypt has been at the mercy of the Nile. Along the river, columns such as this, known as nilometers, have been built to measure the height of the waters. Controlling the river was of paramount importance, with the well-being of the state dependent on the level of the annual floodwaters. The key was in finding a way to reserve these waters for use during the dry summer periods. The ancient Egyptians first attempted this, but it was the founder of modern Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, who built the first ever dam on the Nile in the mid-19th century. To this day, the old brick dam known as the Delta Barrage still stands.
The Nile was on Muhammad Ali's agenda. It was extremely important because Egypt was threatened by drought. Muhammad Ali wanted more cotton and grain plantations, since in those days Egypt used to export these products to Europe.
Muhammad Ali himself laid the dam's first stone in 1847. But this was only the beginning. As demand for water grew, more irrigation projects were completed in the first half of the 20th century. But it wasn't until the early 1950s that Egypt began to put in place plans to finally control the Nile once and for all. In July 1952, a group of army officers carried out a coup d'etat. Egypt's king was dethroned and exiled. A new regime took power. The main officer behind the coup was Jamal Abdel Nasser, with an agenda to modernize and strengthen Egypt. Nasser adopted plans for a massive new dam to be built in southern Egypt to harness the full potential of the Nile. Called the Aswan High Dam, it would be built on this stretch of river at a cost of some $1 billion. Egypt was going to need help.
In the beginning, Britain and the United States went together and told with the World Bank, Nasser, that they were supporting the project.
However, that support came with strings attached. Egypt was expected to join the Western camp. But Nasser was his own man. In the Cold War setting, he was committed to a policy of non-alignment. A policy that displeased the Americans. On July 19, 1956, John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, withdrew the offer to finance the Aswan High Dam. Nasser would not be intimidated. 1 week later, he hit back.
قرار من رئيس الجمهورية بتأميم الشركة العالمية لقناة السويس.
Nasser's decision to nationalize the company that owned the strategic Suez Canal was a bombshell. The revenues paid by ships passing through the canal could help Egypt finance the Aswan High Dam. It was a trump card, but it rattled the powers in Europe and led to the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain, France, and Israel conducted a joint attack on Egypt to win back control of the canal. British and French troops landed in Port Said on the northern tip of the Suez waterway. But this was as far as they went. The invading armies were forced to withdraw under heavy international pressure from the United Nations. Egypt's relations with the West were shattered. Nasser now looked for friends elsewhere. In 1958, Egypt signed an agreement with the Soviet Union for the financing of the High Dam.
The Russians gave Egypt two loans, 400 and 500 million rubles. This was not aid. Egypt paid back these loans from the Suez Canal revenue.
With the Soviet loans, Nasser inaugurated the start of construction of the Aswan High Dam in January 1960. The project was immense. It is said that enough rock was used in the construction of the dam to build 17 great pyramids. Through the 11 years of construction, Egyptians saw the dam as a symbol of national pride and defiance to the West.
The Egyptian people proved their ingenuity by embracing the High Dam project. They glorified it in their songs, in TV and radio shows, movies, plays, and everyday activities. That's how it became such an icon of the nation, something which everybody rallied behind.
Nasser, the father of the project, never lived to see the completion of the dam. Just 4 months before construction was finished, he died of a heart attack. The opening ceremony in January 1971 was attended by Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat. The dam saved the flow of over 30 billion cubic meters of floodwater each year, water that otherwise would be lost into the Mediterranean Sea. Behind the dam, a huge man-made reservoir known as Lake Nasser was created. The water held in this lake was Egypt's insurance policy against the river's unpredictable flow.
The Aswan Dam gave the Egyptians a guarantee that there would always be water there. I mean, during the drought in the 1970s and 1980s in Sudan and Ethiopia, the Egyptians, they could go on cultivating as before because they had all this water behind the dam in Aswan. But perhaps most importantly was that the Aswan Dam in a way nationalized the river Nile in Egypt.
Elsewhere, the river remained untamed. Upstream countries were still at the mercy of the Nile, experiencing at times either famine or devastating floods. But playing with nature was to prove costly for the river and for all those living off it.